Okay, so today we're going to be talking about another significant moment in the Cold War, another significant one of these what we call proxy wars, like Korea was, where we were indirectly fighting the Soviet Union. So how did Vietnam become a flashpoint for the Cold War? So before we can really talk about the Vietnam conflict, the Vietnam War, we have to kind of talk a little bit about the history of Vietnam. So the first question is, how did French decolonization become tied to the Cold War? So Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Sorry, hold on, my dog is barking. All right, sorry about that. I don't even know where it was. All right, so I was saying how Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia were all originally French colonies. So in 1930, this man, his name is Ho Chi Minh. So Ho Chi Minh organized a movement against French colonial rule. It was called, so this was in 1930, and it was called the Indo-Chinese, by the way, that's one word, I just couldn't fit it, Indo-Chinese Communist Party. And he wanted to fight against French rule. So in September of 1945, Ho Chi Minh declares the independence of Vietnam. And what we have is supposedly an independent Vietnam. However, the French opposed this claim of control because it was a communist country. Or actually it was, at this point, they opposed the claim and they wanted to create a more pro-French government. So they didn't feel, the French didn't feel that Ho Chi Minh would be very pro-French, and the French still wanted to have ties with Vietnam. So they wanted to create their own pro-French government in Vietnam. The U.S. actually at this point, we actually urged the French to work with Ho Chi Minh, because at this point we had a very anti-colonial stance. So our attitude was, you know, let the Vietnamese have their independence, work with Ho Chi Minh. But in 1947, a war breaks out between Ho Chi Minh and the French. And so in let me just erase this for a second. I have more stuff to write. So, come on, erase. All right, so in 1947, a war breaks out, like I said, between Ho Chi Minh and the French. In 1948, the French establish a friendly Vietnamese government under the leadership of Bao Dai. So this was in 1948. Now, this was a loose union with the French. It really meant that there was no true independence for the Vietnamese people. And originally, remember, we said the U.S. was willing to work with Ho Chi Minh. Now, in 1949, in China, Chiang Kai-shek, who we're going to learn about maybe next week or the week after, Chiang Kai-shek is defeated. He was the nationalist leader in China. I think I've mentioned him previously. He was defeated, and the People's Republic of China is declared. And China now all of a sudden is communist. So 1949, China is communist. So this changes the way that the U.S. is going to view Ho Chi Minh, because Ho Chi Minh obviously has communist leanings. So the U.S. now saw this French colonial war as integral to the Cold War. So in 1950, the U.S. recognizes the government of Bao Dai. So in 1950, we officially recognize this government. Remember, this is also the same year that the Korean War is starting, so we're having nightmares of all of East Asia becoming, or East and Southeast Asia becoming communist. Think back to that quote I showed you in the video on the Korean War, and how President Eisenhower was talking about the need to contain communism. So we recognize the Bao Dai government, the USSR, and China recognizes the government of Ho Chi Minh. So we send aid to the French war effort. Now, from the Vietnamese point of view, they've gone down this long line of wars. They just finished fighting World War II, where they were invaded by the Japanese, which they refer to as the Japanese War. This they refer to as the French War. And then what they're going to call what we call the Vietnam War, they call the American War. So they're pretty much in a constant state of war from, 1940 till about 1973, when we finally pull out of Vietnam. So their country is completely torn apart by this conflict. So I'm going to show you, this is actually a picture of Ho Chi Minh's tomb, because Ho Chi Minh never actually fully, he dies, I'm not exactly sure what year that he dies, but he never gets to see a resolution to this conflict before he dies. His goal, his wishes for his body was for his body to be cremated and distributed throughout Vietnam. The Vietnamese Communist government decided to do similar to what Stalin did to Lenin, and they embalm his body and put it in a glass coffin, which is in that building behind Liam. However, you're not allowed to take pictures inside there, but I did get to see Ho Chi Minh's body, and it is kind of freaky. So in 1954, there was a conference at Geneva to settle this conflict. Geneva is in Switzerland. So in 1954, there was a conference in Geneva to settle this conflict. The French army had fallen, and basically it was decided that the country would be divided, and in 1956 it would be unified through elections. So it was divided, but then in 1956 there were supposed to be elections, and the country would be reunited. Similar to Korea, similar to China, Germany, we all know how those worked out. So North was controlled by the Viet Minh. Now the Viet Minh are the communists. So the North was under the control of the Viet Minh. The South was controlled basically by the French. In 1954, the French troops begin to withdraw, and there is a fight for power in South Vietnam. And we were supportive of this man, if I remember correctly. Sorry, hold on, I'm just looking at my notes for something. So the U.S. supported a leader called So he was U.S. backed. Supported Ngo Diem, and he was a non-communist nationalist, and he didn't really work with the French, which is why the U.S. supported him, because he was seen as being non-communist, nationalist, and he wasn't kind of linked to the French. However, because we had supported the French government, any government that we supported, they looked at suspiciously. So the South Vietnamese people were not too excited about Ngo Diem. But in 1956, the U.S. began training troops, government officials, paying the salaries of those people, and supplying military equipment. And we took a very anti-communist campaign. And Diem refused to hold elections for reunification because he was afraid that if there was elections, the people would rather go with the Viet Minh in the north rather than his rule in the south. And he became very politically repressive. He attacked those who had resisted French rule. He took large amounts of power over the people. And his main support was coming from those from North Vietnam who had emigrated to the south, and they were given the best jobs. And he tended to favor the large landowners, so he tended to favor the upper class. So by 1960, there was a lot of resistance within South Vietnam to Diem's rule. And basically, an organization called the National Liberation Front was formed. And what the National Liberation Front wanted to do was to overthrow Diem, unify the country, reform the economy, and get rid of the Americans. And in the South, the group that was opposing the government of South Vietnam was called the Viet Cong. And the Viet Cong was being aided by the North. And they tended to use terrorist tactics and guerrilla warfare. And so what we start to see is that the Viet Cong is gaining more support in the countryside. So the peasants and the regular people, they tended to support the communists because they saw that they were going to get more opportunities from the communists. And the wealthy, middle class, business owners, those types of people, they tended to support Diem. But Diem, like I said before, was becoming increasingly more and more repressive over the people. This is actually another monument in the complex where Ho Chi Minh's body is. Here's me with Ho Chi Minh's tomb in the distance. So the question is, we already know how we're involved, but like, how did we really get involved militarily to the level that we did during the Vietnam conflict? So we can see here, this is from 1938 though, but this idea of how communism works and how it was just going to spread and take over everything. So, like I said before, Eisenhower, Kennedy, they all supported Diem, but they were demanding reform in the government. So no one really particularly liked Diem, but the U.S. kind of saw him as the lesser of two evils, but they wanted him to reform. However, he wasn't really being very reform-minded. He tended to be very repressive in his tactics. So therefore, on November 1st, 1963, Diem is overthrown and murdered in an army coup. And we actually were involved in the plot. The U.S. was involved in this plot because we wanted a government in South Vietnam that could actually gain popular support. Because since there was so much support for the Viet Cong, it was really difficult to try to gain. We wanted a government that would be friendly to the people of South Vietnam. So this man here, who's here with President Nixon, he was put into power. His name is... it's a U and a V. So he's put into power, and he's going to govern South Vietnam from 1966 until 1975. So from 1963 on, the U.S. military involvement in Vietnam was continually expanding. In 1969, President Nixon wanted to take on a policy of what he referred to as Vietnamization, where the Vietnamese people were actually taking more power over the government, and the U.S. could engage in a gradual withdrawal. So peace negotiations began in Paris in spring of 1968, and in January of 1973 there was a ceasefire. There was violations of that ceasefire on both sides. So this war was very long fought, very brutal. You could see this is one of the tunnels that the South Vietnamese and the Viet Cong built to try to hide themselves from the U.S. from U.S. bombs and from U.S. attacks. This is actually still a minefield, and you could see this was one of the overlooks to kind of see when helicopters were coming to land. Here you can see supplies being parachuted in. This was the presidential palace in Saigon, which was the capital of South Vietnam. So these were a whole system of tunnels called the Cu Chi tunnels. I forget how it was spelled. Wait. That's how it's spelled, the Cu Chi. So this was a whole tunnel complex built by the Viet Cong, and people actually lived down below ground in these tunnels to avoid attack by the U.S. So you could see this is a Vietnamese, worker which is now like a national park, and you can see the entrance into one of these tunnels, and it's completely covered. Here's me attempting to try to get into one of these tunnels. However, my American hips were not allowing me to actually get into these tunnels. You can see kind of what some of these entrances look like. Here's me down in the tunnels. They actually had to make them a little bit bigger in order to allow tourists to get in, because actually they would have been much smaller. Even here, you had to walk kind of like all crouched over. There's me coming up out of the tunnels. This is an American soldier going into the tunnels to try to root out some of the Viet Cong. You can see this would be what one of these tunnels, how complex the system would be. They would have sleeping quarters and first aid stations and hospitals and kitchens all underground to avoid U.S. detection. This war created a huge anti-war movement in the U.S. There was many protests against this war. This is actually a monk burning himself in protest to the fighting in Vietnam. And like I said, this was a very long, hard-fought war. Ultimately, in 1975, Saigon is attacked, and the North takes over Saigon. It falls in April of 1975, April 30th. Why is this not letting me write all of a sudden? April 30th, 1975, not 1957. Really? There we go. April 30th, 1975, Saigon falls, and we had to basically evacuate very quickly our personnel out of Saigon. So you can see again, this is the presidential palace. These are the tanks that broke through the presidential palace. This is the president. This is the gates of the presidential palace today, and that was April 30th, 1975, when the South Vietnamese troops were coming into the presidential palace. And here you could see what the presidential palace looked like with the South Vietnamese soldiers, and you could see the picture of Ho Chi Minh in the background. There's actually a picture of myself, and my sister who's right there, and then a bunch of people I was with on my tour when I went to Vietnam and Cambodia. So we had to do this very quick withdrawal. This is a very famous picture. This is the top of, everyone says the embassy. It's actually I believe it's like the CIA building. It was an American building in Saigon, and you could see they're trying to evacuate as many people as they can. All these people waiting to get on these helicopters, and it was like helicopter after helicopter, trying to evacuate as many as their personnel, because they knew those people that were loyal to the South Vietnamese were going to be in a very dire situation after the U.S. left. What would happen to these people, and a lot of them were targeted. Interestingly enough, this is a picture of that building today. You can see Saigon is a much different place. There's no buildings in the background back then. This is Saigon today. This is where you can kind of put it into context. So you could see here, this is the building. So this is the square today. To kind of see what Saigon looks like today. It's actually a rather modern, pretty built up, very populated city. So as a result of this, so South Vietnam does fall to the North Vietnamese. It is united under the North Vietnamese government and becomes a communist country. It still is a communist country today, although it's going kind of the route of China, where they're kind of bringing in more capitalism. As a result of this, we were diverting our attention from Europe. So a lot of the Europeans felt that we were devoting too much of our time to Asia. Our prestige suffers as a result of this, because this is like the one war in the world that we lost. Our commitment to Western Europe maintaining freedom from communism was questioned. And a lot of people saw the U.S. as being very ambitious and aggressive and cruel in our tactics in Vietnam. So I want you to think about this question. Should the U.S. have gotten involved in Vietnam? Were we wise to do this, or should we have just stayed out of the whole situation? So I want you to think about that, and I'll see you guys in class.